All right, welcome everybody to day 2 of the Just Transition Summit. We're very glad to have you. I think we have some more people coming in as the day goes on, but we're very glad to have you here with us at the beginning. My name is Matthew Emick. I'm the director of the Scontras Labor Center, sponsoring this event today. So to just go over a few logistical things, I know that some people had issues with the parking app. If you did, some people on the second or third try, it finally works. So if you didn't scan your code or you had problems, if you didn't scan your code at all, please go out to the registration table where we have the code for you. It's very important you do that within 30 minutes of parking. If you tried and it didn't work, try doing it a second or third time. If it still doesn't work, if you go see Rob out at the front desk, he can give you directions. He's already let the parking office know there's a problem. So very important. Parking is an issue here. So if you have any problems, let me know or go see Rob at the front desk and try it a few times. If you have it scanned at all, make sure you get the code. And another few logistical things, restrooms, if you go out the doors you just came in, around the corner from the registration table, out the doors, the restrooms are around to your left. They're on all 3 floors that way. And so I want to just welcome everyone. Had a great day yesterday, and I want to give a quick overview of today. In just a few minutes, we'll be hearing from Todd Vachon of framing exactly what we're talking about when we talk about just transitions. And then after that, we'll have a panel discussion. 2 very good friends of mine who are true warriors in the labor movement that I am really excited to have on our stage, talking about the ways labor and climate intersect that we don't think of. Be followed by Rick Levy from the Texas AFL-CIO, who's done some tremendous work. Then we'll have a break at 11 and go into our breakout sessions. A phrase I heard yesterday in one of the panels I was going to use today, and somebody used it, so I will quote, is that change moves at the speed of trust. And if we are going to build trust, we need to come together, and we're taking admittedly a bold step with our breakout sessions at 11 o'clock, bringing some folks together who otherwise probably wouldn't be talking to each other. They've done a lot of prep work. We have very skilled moderators. We're very excited to really delve into the complexity of labor and environmental issues. We're looking at 3 case studies specific to Maine. One was an effort to ban cruise ships here in Portland a few years ago and how that could have affected jobs of longshoremen. The other is the current debate over offshore wind and where to site a wind port and whether or not it should be on a place called Sears Island. And then the third one is a very, very complex ongoing debate between defense workers and peace activists. And we know that that's bold territory to go into, but we feel very confident and hope everyone will walk away from those sessions with just a very rich understanding of just how complex and frankly messy this work can be to really work towards just transitions and change. Lunch will be on the 2nd floor in the mezzanine. And at 1:45, we have 2 arts workshops. I'm very excited to have arts elements. Christopher Sims is here from Illinois, who will be looking at arts as a tool of achieving climate justice and social justice. And then one of our arts professors, Jana Arendt, will be doing the digital rage room, the ethics of breaking stuff. That will actually be in Luther Bonney Hall, which is across the street. Braylee Sublet is in the back. She's raising her hand. If you're going to go to the digital rage room, Braylee will meet you on the 2nd floor by the entrance to the Skywalk. So if you can meet there, probably about 1:35, if you can meet Braylee, and she'll take you over to Luther Bonney because we needed a computer lab for that session. So that's very important. And then after that, we have 2 other great breakout sessions. Camilo Viveros from UMass Dartmouth will be here giving a workshop on climate justice, power, and privilege, how we can really examine power and privilege dynamics in the climate justice and building our movements. Our next speaker will be giving a breakout session, Todd Vachon, on how to form a climate caucus in your local union. And then at 4:30, we have a really great panel, something very important, an issue here in Maine for those of you who've come from out of state. Tribal indigenous issues are a huge issue here in Maine, and the state of Maine has not been good to indigenous tribes, as you can imagine, and the fact that any debate we have about justice for land has to start out with the fact that we, people who look like me, are sitting on this land is in itself an injustice in many ways. So we're going to be delving very deeply into that. So that is our overview. And with that, I will turn things over to Katie and our next speaker.
Good morning, everybody. This morning, I was like, what maniac scheduled the first session on a Friday at 9 a.m. and then I realized it was me. So I'm sorry about that, but it's really good to see you all here this early. And I'm really excited to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Todd Vachon. Todd is the director of the Labor Education Action Research Network at the Rutgers University, where he also serves as an assistant professor of labor studies and employment relations. Todd has written extensively about the intersection of labor and climate justice, including his recent books, Clean Air and Good Jobs, U.S. Labor and the Struggle for Climate Justice, and Revaluing Workers Towards a Just and Sustainable Future. Clean Air and Good Jobs actually served as an inspiration for the theme of this conference. In it, Todd explores different frameworks for what a just transition means, and exploring these different frameworks was the goal of this conference and something Todd will be diving into with us very shortly. In addition to his scholarship, Todd is deeply active in the labor movement. He serves as the president of the New Brunswick chapter of the Rutgers American Association of University Professors and co-chairs the union's Climate Justice Committee. He's also the vice president for the Higher Education American Federation of Teachers New Jersey and a founding member of the National Environmental and Climate Justice Caucus within the American Federation of Teachers. I'm not sure how you have any time after that very full list of achievements. He also currently serves as the president of the Middlesex Somerset County Central Labor Council in New Jersey. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Todd Vachon.
Thanks, Matt. Well, good morning, fellow workers. Is this microphone on? And fellow students, right? We're all students. I'm a student of life, right? They say the day that you stop learning is the day that you die, right? So we're all always learning. No matter how many hats or degrees you get, you're always a student of life. So in this journey, we're all in it together. I want to thank Matt and Katie for the kind introduction and Scontris Center for putting this really important summit on. In particular, being bold and taking the risk of bringing some of these kind of conflicting viewpoints together and really getting people to begin to have the complicated conversations that we need to have to truly create the just, sustainable, democratic future that we all, want and deserve and need. And I think I have a clicker here somewhere so I can change my slides. Is there a clicker? Down under, maybe? It's this. Oh. Oh, look at that. All right. So yeah, as Katie mentioned, I've written a book recently on this. And when I talk about the framing for just transition, I think it's really important to kind of give my personal story of why I came to write about this. So you can understand that I'm not just some academic scholar that thought this is a great topic to go out and do research on. It's actually something that has been part of my own being since a very young age, right? So when I first wrote the book and I got an interview on a podcast, they said, why did you choose to write a book on labor and climate change? And I was a little caught off guard, and I said, well, I guess it started back in 1989, right? So a lot of things happened in 1989 in my life and in our country. I was 13 years old at the time. My parents owned a small gas station in eastern Connecticut, small town of Salem, Connecticut, where I grew up, population 1,200. And I grew up in the gas station, right? Me and my dog. Everybody in town knew me and my dog because it's where they went to get their milk, their eggs, their gas, their lottery tickets, right? But around 1989, something was happening in town. There was a highway that was incomplete, and it dumped all the cars off the highway coming from Hartford to New London, would come off and drive by our store to continue their commute to work. Well, they're beginning to finish that highway. So our town was about to be erased off the map again, right? So our business was facing bankruptcy. My parents were facing foreclosure on their home. So it was very difficult economic times. But through the volunteer fire department, one of my father's friends, he was very involved in the volunteer fire department, was in the carpenters union and said, look, we're building a new unit on the nuclear power plant a few towns over, and they're going to need a lot of carpenters. Come on down to the union hall, and we'll get you into the carpenters union. And he did. And within a year, my family transformed from being working poor to middle class, right? The difference of having a union. I got health insurance, I got glasses, I got braces, I got Nikes, like when they were, like Jordans when they were new, when Jordan was still playing basketball, right? So that was really transformative for me, like understanding the value of a union. So from that point forward, I only ever tried to work in unionized workplaces as a teenager in high school, through college, and then after. But something else important happened in 1989 also. Does anybody know who this guy is right here that's speaking at the mic? Nope. Dr. Hansen. Yeah, get this guy coffee. Dr. James Hansen from NASA went and made a presentation before Congress about the greenhouse effect and how the burning of fossil fuels was leading to the warming of the climate, of the globe, which would ultimately lead to climate change and all of the sorts of disasters that they were predicting 50 years ago that we are now living through today. And I had a really great science teacher that year in my school, and he taught us all about the greenhouse effect. And it really hit me because I grew up in a rural area. I liked being outside. I really was in tune to nature. It was part of my childhood, going out and running through the woods and building tree forts. And I valued nature, and I wanted to protect and preserve nature. So at the very early age, I already had it in me that I'm really pro-labor and I need to have good jobs. My dad's job that pays for us is a nuclear power plant, right? But I also want to protect the climate and the environment. I'm wondering why the government's not doing anything about it. So I didn't think of it in those terms then, right? But the seed was planted at that point for me. So fast forward a little bit, I ended up actually going through the carpenter's apprenticeship program myself and became a journeyman carpenter. I worked at that exact same nuclear power plant many times. When they did shutdowns, the carpenters would come in and build the scaffolding so that all the other trades could fix the pipes and electric wires and things like that. And I worked in the trade until 2010, or 2009, 2010, when the Great Recession hit. And guess what happened when the Great Recession hit? Nobody had a job, right? So I was unemployed for 18 months. My unemployment insurance ran out. I have 2 young kids with a third one on the way. And I'm looking at, I might have a foreclosure on my home, right? So this is like a repeat of 1989, but for me now, at the same age that my father was about then, right? So at that point, I decided to go back to college. My wife, always wiser wife, said, "You're always reading all these books about sociology and political science and labor history. Why don't you go back to school and get a degree?" So I did. I went to the University of Connecticut, and I immediately discovered this thing called the Labor Education Program, which I had no idea there was any such thing. The Labor Education Program does adult education for union workers. So it's like I get to be a professor, but I get to work with union people and teach them about collective bargaining and organizing and fighting the boss. Sign me up. What do I do? So I ended up staying on and getting a PhD. So this is kind of my proud photo of PhD graduation, but with my hard hat on, because I'm still a carpenter, right? I still pay my dues. I'm still a card-carrying union carpenter. Haven't worked in the trade in 15 years, but I still am a carpenter. And I occasionally go to union meetings still too. So when I was in grad school, doing research, you have to, of course, write a dissertation. And first thing I realized after about a year there was the boss was doing lots of things to us that I wasn't used to have and happened to me because I'd always worked in a union setting. Like we'd get an email that totally canceled our health benefits and made us students instead of workers. So we went from the employee health insurance to the student health insurance. Or to get emails that funding was cut and all these people were going to get laid off and lose their job. I said, you know what? This really sucks working without a union. So a bunch of us got together and we actually organized a local of the United Auto Workers with 2,200 graduate student workers at the University of Connecticut. And we won that union election. And I was elected as the first president of the union. So as the president of a union, I feel like, we have some kind of voice and power. We threatened to go on strike. We did this huge sit-in. We won all these massive gains. What can we do next? It's a democratic organization. I want to poll the members. What do you care about? We have a voice now. What do we want to fight for? And to my surprise, one of the top issues that our members said they cared about was climate change, right? The year's 2015. It's 2016, right? We had entered the Paris Climate Accord. Trump just pulled us out of the Paris Climate Accord. Think about graduate workers at a state university. A huge number of them are actually climate scientists, right? A lot of them are social scientists that are studying the impacts of climate change. And more importantly, the demographic age group that's a group that's obviously more in tune and concerned with the environmental future because they're going to have to live with it for the rest of their lives, right? If you're a young adult and you're starting a family, and I hear young people now saying they don't even want to have children because of the uncertainty of the future with climate change, but also with the political environment. So that kind of rose to the top. And I said, how can we do as a union climate change? So I got involved with a group in Connecticut called the Roundtable on Climate and Jobs, which brought together, much like you guys are doing here at Scontress today, labor groups, environmentalist groups, faith-based groups, environmental justice groups, and started to have those difficult conversations and try and find common ground. So as I was doing all this work and I'm talking to my advisor about what I'm going to do my dissertation on, and he's wondering why I'm so far behind on my dissertation because I'm out doing all this activist work, he said, I think that your dissertation is your activist work. Just start taking notes and interviewing people, and this is your research. So there it is, my dissertation, Clean Air and Good Jobs. So just to quantify this, right, that's my own anecdotal story. But if you look at the data, you can see if you go back to the end of World War II to now, two major trends that defined our generation here is rising income inequality and rising greenhouse gas emissions, right? You see that greenhouse gas emissions went up from 5,000 to nearly 37,000 million metric tons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere per year. And then if you look at the income of the top 1%, it jumped from about 7% to now about 23% of all income going to just the top 1% of earners. And these two things are related, right? The top 1% of earners are responsible for 50% of all carbon emissions by consumption, right? Who has private jets, who has yachts, who has 15 homes, who's always flying all around the world. And just think about that, right? That's just by consumption, right? There's other ways that we produce a lot of carbon, but just that fact alone is very stunning. So let's bring the two concepts of labor and environment together, right? I think as everybody in this room knows, there's a history of conflict, right? But there's also a history of cooperation. It's a really mixed history. And a lot of the cooperation parts, I think, are often forgotten. People like to dwell on the negatives, like, the union workers really wanted to build the power plant, and the environmentalists really didn't, and they're out there fighting each other. The United Auto Workers and the United Steel Workers were major supporters of the Clean Air and Clean Water Acts, which created the Environmental Protection Agency, right? The president of the UAW was a fierce advocate for this. The steel workers were the really earliest advocates for environmental protections because their members were suffering the health impacts, right? In 1947 in Donora, Pennsylvania, it's a famous incident known as the Donora death fog, where there was a plant and the fumes came out of the plant, settled over the working class community at night, and over 100 workers died in their sleep. The steel workers became advocates for health and safety, not only in the workplace, but in the communities surrounding the workplace, and really began to make that connection between environmental harms and workers' safety, right? That wasn't really there previously. The environmental movement before the 50s was about land conservation. Labor movement brought in the human health concerns into the environmental movement that we then started to see in the 70s going forward with the environmental movement that we know today. So mixed bag, right? There's lots of opportunities where they can cooperate, and there's lots of opportunities for conflict. Some of the major drivers for conflict around climate change that I have identified in my research are, one is what I call disparities in bargaining power. You have jobs in, say, fossil fuel power plants to pay $100,000, $120,000, $130,000 a year with a pension, and you can do that job with a high school degree. And then you have jobs installing rooftop solar panels for $15 an hour with no union, no retirement, and no job security, right? So just on the surface, it's like, I don't want to give up this good job for that shit job, pardon my French. Another one is just the general dearth of good job opportunities. I mean, we see, unfortunately, a lot of young folks are going to come out of college with a degree and debt, and you're looking at a labor market. What are the jobs that are going to pay me enough to be able to live on my own, right? The cost of living is so high. Can I move out of my parents' house and afford to pay back the college debt and pay rent on the jobs that are available to me right now? There's not a lot of great jobs in our economy right now to be had. Third major driver has been job blackmail by employers. So you actually have employers who will threaten to close and move their facilities if an environmental regulation passes. So they will go directly to their workers and say, look, I need you to tell your congresspeople not to pass this environmental law because we're going to have to shut down the plant and you're all going to get laid off, right? So actually directly threatening the workers with job blackmail. Another piece, a real critical one that we don't think about as much in the US, but if you take a global view, we have such a weak social safety net in this country. Our health insurance is through our employment, right? It's not a basic right that you get health care. If you get a good job with health insurance, you want to keep your health insurance for yourself, for your spouse, for your children. When you lose your job, you lose that health insurance. When you lose your job, you stop contributing to Social Security. You don't have any retirement. You're not making retirement savings anymore, right? The job that you get that has good benefits is the job that you want to keep because you need those benefits, right? European context, you just get health insurance as a citizen, as a right, as a human right. So you see the transition happening more rapidly in countries that have broader social safety nets because the workers can transition from one job to another, but still keep their health insurance and still know they're going to be able to retire when they get older, right? But in the US, it creates this incentive to fight to protect the job that does offer health insurance and a retirement. And finally, there have been, unfortunately, incidences of environmental elitism, is what I call it, where environmentalists don't consider the impacts of workers in a plant and do things such as show up at a plant and stuff rags into the vents to say, keep the fumes inside. And there's plenty of incidences of that, which genuinely piss off workers for a really obviously good reason, right? So there's a history of that too. So those are the major drivers of this. And so how are we going to solve this problem? We need to be able to have good jobs, and we want to protect the environment, and we want to prevent and reverse climate change. So the name of our conference here, our summit, is Just Transitions, right? So the concept of just transition actually originates out of the work of this man right here, Tony Mazzocchi, who was a leader of the Oil, Chemical, and Atomic Workers Union. He famously said, there's a super fund for dirt, we should have a super fund for workers, right? Everybody knows what the environmental super fund is. If a plant closes and the dirt and the soil's all polluted, the employer has money, they have to clean up that mess. But what about the workers? You just laid all the workers off, and now they don't have a job, the whole community has no tax base to pay for their public schools, the economy's declining, they should clean up that mess that they created also, right? So where's the money for the workers? And his union, the Oil, Chemical, and Atomic Workers Union, right? Think about this, and this is one of the topics today. They represented workers in some of their locals that built atomic weapons. And he says, this is a real conundrum, right? Do I want my livelihood to be based on the risk of a nuclear holocaust, right? There needs to always be a risk of a nuclear holocaust for me to have a good job. So how can we come up with a way that we get rid of the social ills, but not place the burden on the backs of the workers it's not their fault, right? They didn't create atomic bombs. They got a job at a factory, right? So this is his idea of creating a just transition. In my research, so I spent, 7, 8 years participating in 3 different blue-green groups and through my own union work, and started to question people and listen and pay attention when a lot of people throw the phrase just transition around. But there wasn't one clear definition of it. And this is really what I think Matt was hoping to bring into the conversation today, is thinking about the different ways that just transition can be thought of and conceived of. So I actually identified 3 different frameworks, which I call protective, proactive, and transformative. So the protective vision for a just transition is a lot like Tony Mazzocchi's super fund for workers. You have protections in place when a plant closes because of a social policy, right? We're going to pass this environmental regulation and we're going to close coal plants because we're no longer going to use coal as an energy source. So you have protections in place for the workers. You have wage replacement for them. You have free job education and retraining and job placement opportunities for them to go on and find a new career, right? That's the idea of having a protective just transition. You're protecting the workers, but it's really at the local level, at the workplace level, and it's really in reaction to an event, right? Like a plant closure triggers a set of benefits. And we have something like this already in the US, which came about during the 90s when we had a lot of trade agreements called the Trade Adjustment Act. But for those in labor in the room, no, it's woefully underfunded, really inadequate, and really actually difficult to even get access to prove that you're worthy of getting this benefit. But the Trade Adjustment Act does do some of those things. It provides education, it provides some extended unemployment benefits to help you weather the storm through another job. So the protective just transition frame is that, but done right? Like a Trade Adjustment Act done right and properly funded. Now the proactive frame was more of the climate activists within the labor movement saying, look, to address climate change, we know we have to get rid of fossil fuels. So labor needs to have a seat at the table in developing that plan of phasing out fossil fuels, right? We can't leave it to just the environmentalists or just the government. One of the phrases I heard a lot was, if you're not at the table, you're probably on the menu, right? If we know fossil fuels are going to be phased out, we, as labor, need to help shape that plan so that labor rights are baked into it and protections for the workers are baked into the transition. So the proactive one is often what's been called a Green New Deal. I often heard people say a World War II style economic mobilization, meaning a society, economy-wide transition away from fossil fuels. This involves a lot of industrial planning, investment policy. We started to see little hints of that in the Biden administration, right? There was a lot of pullback on it in the end, but like the Inflation Reduction Act had incentives. It didn't directly start and fund projects, but it had incentives for projects to use, for example, project labor agreements, to use domestically sourced content, meaning like steel and products made by union workers in the US. There were incentives for using labor that had apprenticeship programs. And of course, the building trades run the largest apprenticeship programs in the US. And I would say one of the best apprenticeship programs in the world are our building trades apprenticeship programs in the US. So those kind of things, right? Industrial planning, investment policy. And I'm going to get to that last bullet in a minute. I'll come back to that. The third frame is what I call transformative. And this is coming largely out of folks that were more in tune to environmental justice and climate justice issues, saying, look, we need to take care of the workers, but we also have to acknowledge the historic racism built into our environmental injustices in our society. Where have polluting plants been cited historically? Because of NIMBY movements, not in my backyard movements, saying, no, we're not going to have that trash incinerator in our affluent neighborhood, and they fight it, and it doesn't get built. But guess what? It gets built down the road in Newark instead, in the predominantly low-income black and brown neighborhoods. So the history of the citing of pollution, but then also the history of who got the benefits of the jobs in the fossil fuel industry, right? You think back to the 50s and 60s, things were not so great in trying to go get a job at a power plant, right? If you're a black worker versus a white worker, and everybody's hiring their cousin and their son and their family. So how do we address both the environmental issues for workers and the environmental issues for communities? It involves a more transformative vision. So transformative just transition, folks would often say things like system change, not climate change. We need to look at the root causes of both problems, because if you really go down to the basic core of it, it's the same people that want to pollute the planet for profit, that want to screw over workers for profit, right? It's a common enemy, right? It's a common system that extracts profit out of the exploitation of labor and out of the exploitation of natural resources. Why are we fighting with each other? Right? So that's the transformative vision. We put these on a chart and kind of think about it. You'll notice that they're nested within each other, right? The transformative one is the most expansive and broadest, and arguably the most difficult to achieve, right? But within it, it contains all the elements of a proactive transition and all of the elements of a protective just transition. So if you just want to read through these, the first line is income replacement, early retirement, education, job placement for displaced workers. All three frames would include that. Any just transition should include that. Economic support for impacted communities, including tax-based replacement and economic development. So when a plant closes in a rural area and 80% of the town works for the plant, guess what? There's no tax money to fund the public schools and the fire department and the police and the public services. So how do we have money to backfill and ensure that those whole communities don't collapse? That's within all three frames. Now we start to get into developing a long-term economic plan to decarbonize the economy. The protective frame doesn't consider that, right? It's thinking more in response to crises, but the proactive and transformative want to envision a future and build a future. Social dialogue, having a seat at table for labor in the development of the plan. Again, forward thinking, so it's only in the second two. Now this one here is where I add the question mark, right? Addressing climate justice by confronting existing environmental, racial, and economic inequalities. Absolutely part of the transformative plan, at the base of having a transformative just transition. But it could be part of a proactive plan or not, depending on who is in the room and at the table when you're developing some sort of plan, right? Are we having a labor, environmental justice partnership? Or are we going alone as labor, right? So there are different configurations of blue-green groups around the country that do this in different ways, right? Some are very inclusive and expansive, and some are more narrow and really just focused on labor and green jobs. And then finally, transforming the energy sector from profit-driven to public interest model is really only part of the transformative design, right? If the profit motive is what you're making every decision on, how can we make the decision be instead based on what's good for humanity, what's good for the environment, what's good for workers? It needs to be a decision that's based on a different outcome, not just profit, right? Unless the profit is shared and it's owned by everybody, right? In which case, then we all want the profit to go up, but unfortunately, it's not that way. So those are my 3 frames for just transition, and I think that's the part that you wanted me to kind of uplift that people can think about when you go through the panels today. But my big takeaway is really, we're all in this together. We all need good jobs. We all need a healthy, livable planet and drinking water and air to breathe, right? We all need to put food on the table and take care of our families, right? So we need to get together and have these difficult conversations, and I'm really proud of the Scontra Center for starting this conversation today around how we can do that and how we can build the world that we all need. And that is what I've got for y'all. Thank you. Sorry, a few minutes over. Right?
So thank you, Todd. We're behind schedule. We have a guest zooming in from Canada for our next session. So Todd will be here the rest of the conference. He'll be selling his books. Actually, I'll put in a plug. His book, great book, Clean Air and Good Jobs, written by a great scholar, is for sale out in the lobby. So
I'll sign it for you too.
Yeah, so Todd will be here if you have any other questions for him. So just want to thank you for Todd. So has Alisha logged in, Zach? Great.
Can you see me and hear me? Are we? Oh, there we are. Good morning, everyone.
All right. So our next session, like I said earlier, I'm really excited to have 2 amazing people. Alisha on our screen was going to be here with us today, had something come up. She's joining us from Ottawa. Are you in Ottawa right now? Or are you?
I am. I'm in the belly of the beast, and as you guys know, there's a lot going on in Canada right now. So yes.
Okay. So to introduce our guests, first of all, with me on the stage here is Leticia Zavala. Leticia was born in Zacapu, Michoacan, Mexico in 1979. At the age of 6, her family migrated to the U.S. and immediately started following the migrant stream from Florida to Ohio, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. In her teenage years, she became a member of the Farm Labor Organizing Committee, FLOC, as her family was working on a union farm. With the support of Migrant Education Foundation, she obtained a scholarship that helped pay her way to college. She has a bachelor's degree in sociology from Florida Southern College. After college, she got the call to return to the fields as an organizer and joined the ranks of the Farm Labor Organizing Committee. Since then, she has worked with immigrant communities in Mexico and North Carolina, pushing to improve working and living conditions in agricultural workers. She's a member of Colectivo Binacional de Mujeres Migrantes, the binational collective of immigrant women, and part of a migrant advisory council for the city of Zacapu, Michoacan. He is currently a founder and leader of El Futuro es Nuestro. It's Our Future, a farm worker-led nonprofit that is leading the way to improve working and living conditions for farm workers in North Carolina. And our guest here on Zoom is Alisha Kang. Alisha is fluent in French and English. She was born in Cape Breton, Nova Scotia, raised in Sherbrooke, Quebec, which isn't too far from here. She joined the public service in Canada in 2003 at the Fortress of Louisbourg, a national park site in Nova Scotia. In August of 2020, Alisha joined the Federal Black Employee Caucus and quickly became the Ontario region representative for that union. She is a member of the Union of National Employees. She became known for her tenacity and was elected as a Two-Spirit LGBTQ plus human rights delegate in 2022. She is currently the president of the Union of National Employees of Canada, overseeing 20,000 members and 80 collective bargaining agreements. And if I believe, Alisha, you're the first woman of color in that position, is that correct?
I am. And we also have members outside of Canada. All our members are also in the consulates and embassies across the world.
And she is also published over 24 works of fiction, and she's proudest of her 22-year-old son, KL, who is a budding activist studying law, and her 26-year-old daughter, Cairo, who is a scientist on the autism spectrum. So welcome our 2 panelists here. And as I was saying, we have several professors in the room. There's a thing of labor history that unfortunately labor history is written in a certain way that only talks about a certain demographic of people, people who look a lot like me. And those are often people who are standing on podiums and on the mics. But I know from firsthand experience working with both Leticia and Alisha, if you're looking for a next labor history book to write, the book should be written about people like Leticia and Alisha, who are truly in the trenches on a daily basis. So for both of you, I would like, first of all, Alisha, I'll ask you first. Can you tell us a little bit about just how you got into the labor movement?
Absolutely. So I come from a family of labor activists. I'm from Nova Scotia in Cape Breton. We had coal mines, and so my family worked in the coal mines. And my mom was also in Canada. Most of the federal public service workers are unionized, and my mom worked for the Coast Guard. And so I kind of grew up in a labor sort of intensive family. And I would say the Atlantic of Canada and Quebec are heavily unionized regions. A lot of it is because it was blue collar workers that were being exploited by, private companies to increase profit. And so those areas of the country are extremely heavily unionized. And so when I was hired in the government, I knew I was going into a unionized workforce, and I wanted that because I knew that employers love to exploit employees and squeeze them for everything that they can get out of them for their own profit. And so I did not want to be an exploited worker. And I, soon got involved in finding out what was going on in the local and, supporting other union members. But I really didn't get super active in the labor movement until, which is the story of many people, until my own rights were extremely violated in the workplace. And I thought the union was like, these other people. And I realized that really the union is every member that stands up against oppression and exploitation in the workplace. And that was immensely empowering. And I got on the collective bargaining team of my actual collective bargaining group within my union, because as you know, there are several within my union. And I kind of got addicted to being able to push back on exploitation and see the needle move forward a little bit. And I saw the inextricable connection between union activism and human rights. And so it was sort of the perfect storm because I love both of those things. And so I could not see myself in any other sphere pushing and advancing workers' rights. So that's a bit of my origin story for you.
Thank you. And how about you, Leticia? What can you tell us?
Well, I saw my first grievance in action when I was 13. We were working on a farm in Ohio, and one of the supervisors would sexually harass like the teenagers, right? So oftentimes we would go to school, and because it was a common housing, somebody would come and pick everybody up that went to school and take them to the field so we could work after school. And the supervisor always offered himself, and he would harass the teenage girls. And when my parents found out about it, they decided to take action. They said, we're not going to let them load the cucumbers, right? Because we would pick cucumbers and lay all the buckets down, and then at the end of the day, the supervisor would come and we would load the truck. And we said, we're going to get the grower's attention by not letting him load. And so he came, and he refused to not let anybody else load, and the grower wasn't coming. And so my dad threw himself in front of the tractor so that he wouldn't move forward. And we were fired. We were fired, so we were kicked out of the migrant housing, of course, because our jobs came with housing. And we were left without housing and a job because of this. And we heard that there was a union organizing and trying to improve worker conditions for that. And we joined the union. We were able to get our jobs back. The supervisor wasn't fired, but he was transferred to another position. And I learned that in order to really create change, like it came with sacrifice, and that you needed to consistently look for it and fight for it, because that's the only way.
So a question for both of you, as we talk about labor and climate, when people hear those two words together, they often think of alternative energy. I think a lot of the discussion, even our own promotional posters for this event, showed pictures of solar panels. And people think that when we talk about labor as a climate as a labor issue, we think of the transition from dirty to clean energy, or we think of cleaning up polluted sites or shutting down power plants. But both of you in your organizations have your members have interacted with climate in ways that a lot of people don't think about. And so, Alisha, I'd ask you to start. If you could tell us especially about the work that your firefighter members have been seeing in Canada.
Yeah, and I guess I want to kind of back up a little bit and then get to that point. I work for the Park Service in Canada, equivalent to the Park Service in the U.S., and they're unionized workers. And we have scientists and historians that are maintaining like what's going on in climates, because we have to protect species that are at risk, and the environment of the parks themselves. And so I would go so far as to say that they have been sounding the alarm for over 2 decades, and they've been able to sound the alarm because they're protected by the fact that they have a union, and that they cannot be silenced about the issues that are happening. And so now you fast forward, we've been sounding the alarm, and this past summer in August, there was a storm that they call once in a lifetime storm. And unfortunately, we're having more and more once in a lifetime storms every 2 or 3 years. And what happened in Jasper was that 4 lightning strikes happened within the park, which is unheard of in the sphere of working in a park at the same time, which means the ignition was in multiple places, and the fact that the ignition was in multiple places meant that they were all moving towards the centralized city of Jasper, which is a town that is really a resort town that exists for the promotion of the parks themselves. And so it is pretty much a town that is created just for tourism. It is not actually a place that exists outside of tourism. And because of that, the members have to live in the housing that the employer provides and buy their food at an extremely high cost within the city if they're going to be able to eat. And if the employer is displeased with them or they're reprimanded, the employer decides what they can do within the housing and how they can move within the city. And my understanding is that you cannot actually be homeless in that city, because they will put you on a bus, and not the employer, but the town will put you on a bus and relocate you to be homeless somewhere else. And so that creates some really interesting scenarios where you're living where you work and you're buying where you work from people that are increasing the cost. It goes back to, the old mining sort of structure where you're living in mining housing, you're buying all your food, you're in debt to your employer, and what you're taking away is very little money. And so not only did my workers, that are part of my union lose their employment, they lost their housing, and they lost the places they would buy gas from or buy their food from. And so the response was, well, we want this up and running again because there's so much money to be made in this town that was created just for tourism. The employer's interest was in getting the workers back to work, whether they had housing or not, to the point that we know that they may have displaced people to put senior people in housing, and because some of our members' housing survived, but the management's housing did not survive, and so they evicted staff, which is, you can imagine you've lost your employment, your house, and everything that you have, and the concern is to get the operations back up and running for the money. So I have to say that it is, it is very much, the environment is causing people to lose everything because of the storms that are happening. And I think that gives you a pretty good snapshot of what was happening with the members this summer. And the firefighters live in that community. So it's not just the people who interact with, visitors that live there. The firefighters live there. And we also lost a very young firefighter in the fires this summer. They were only about 23 years old, and, fires are very unpredictable in terms of winds and change as they start. And the other firefighters, even though they were in a state of loss, had to continue to try to fight the fires while this was going on. And so you can imagine the amount of stress that the members were going through while this was happening.
Thank you. And I'm going to, in a few minutes, ask some questions about how you're working to respond to all that. But I'm going to turn over to Leticia and basically ask the same question. And I know I'm personally blown away that you, Alisha, just have talked about a lot of parallels that I never expected Canadian federal workers to have with farm workers in North Carolina. And so, Leticia, if you could tell us a little bit about your members, where they come from, and maybe explain about the visa structure they work under and how you're dealing with climate issues with farm workers.
Yes. So It's Our Future is a nonprofit organization that started just recently. We started kind of organizing during the pandemic. A lot of our members are H-2A workers, which are workers that come here on visas every year to fill the need of agricultural employers, right? So every year in the States, we have about 230,000 H-2A workers that come into the States. And North Carolina has the largest employer, which is the North Carolina Growers Association, that last year brought in 11,300 workers to work in 27 different crops, mainly Christmas trees, tobacco, and sweet potato. But a lot of these workers come every year. They're recruited in Mexico with promises of great wealth and fortune, and sometimes they're asked for money in order to get on a list. They come here, they live in employer housing. The employer controls your immigration status, so if he fires you, he cancels your visa automatically. He controls your transportation, your housing, and very similar to them, there's often forced meal plans where they will lock the kitchens in the housing facility, and only like the supervisor's wife is allowed to go in there and use the kitchen, and will sell you food for crazy amounts. There's no sanitation requirements, and there's no accountability for how the food is served or where it's served. And so we see a lot of injustices. Of course, it scares people to speak up because their livelihood depends so much on their employer.
And what can you tell us about the way your members, when they're picking in the fields, especially in the summer times, how the climate crisis has been affecting them?
Well, agriculture has always been affected by climate, right? Pesticides like deforestation that big ag has done. But the biggest thing that we're seeing now is heat. Like we're seeing, the past 3 years, we've had farm workers die due to heat. And we're seeing it more and more. We're seeing workers that can't handle the heat and are having to like walk out of the field and get into the shade to breathe. But we don't have right to breaks. And we have laws that require water, but they're not enforced. And oftentimes the water is dirty or it's hot, or you have to purchase it from your supervisor as well. And then there's no requirement for air conditioning, right? So these workers are working 12, 14-hour days in the heat, and then they come home to overcrowded housing with no access to a refrigerator, no air conditioning, so your body never cools down, right? And it's a constant thing. Last year, we saw like three groups of workers that were sent to Mexico. Like one group was found they were in the shade because it was so hot. And when the grower arrived, he said, you either get back in the field or get in the bus and go back to Mexico. And half of those workers decided to go back to Mexico because they were so scared that they were not going to make it through the summer and picking tobacco.
And I just want to ask a question for both of you. I'll ask you, Leticia, first, and then have you, Alisha. When we were talking the other day, you were talking about, when you said you've had farm worker deaths. Can you tell us a little bit more about you had mentioned a specific person and some of the work you've been doing to get justice for that?
Yes, so in 2023, Jose Arturo passed away on a farm. It's the biggest sweet potato producer in the country. He had been in the U.S. for about a week. It was his first time coming to the U.S. to work sweet potato under the guest worker program. After a week of work, he told the grower that he did not feel well, and he did not think he was going to be able to work the next day. And he was told that if he didn't go to work, he would be sent back to Mexico and he would never return. So he went to work. At about 9 o'clock, when he threw the sweet potato bucket to one of the supervisors to the truck, he went forward and people were trying to take him to the side of the road, and the supervisor said, that's how it feels. That's how it is. Everybody feels like they're gonna die, but ain't no beep, beep, beep died on me yet. Well, half an hour later, he passed out in the middle of the field. They put him in the bus with shut windows, no air conditioning, for 50 minutes. 50 minutes before they decided to call an ambulance. And he passed away. And these are the types of things that we're seeing consistently in North Carolina.
Can you tell us about the way your organization's responding to those type of things?
Oh, so we launched a campaign that's called No More Deaths. Ever since 2020, the Mexican consulate has transferred 20 bodies of H-2A workers to Mexico. Right? And so we are, we're educating our members. A lot of agencies say, oh, let's educate about heat symptoms. Like, everybody knows you don't need to get educated on heat symptoms. When you feel sick, you feel sick. You want to know what you can do about it, right? And how you're going to be protected if you speak up. So we have a training called Collective Responsibility, and it's educating workers to help their peers make correct decisions, right? And not put their lives at risk. Understanding that when a worker decides to walk out, he's sacrificing his life, his immigration status, his housing, the opportunity to come back. And it's a big decision to decide to speak up and decide to walk out or to ask for medical attention. So we're educating our peers. We're pressuring our employer. So we're asking the North Carolina Growers Association to implement a heat protection protocol, which requires clean, cold water in the fields, the right to medical attention when we feel sick, and breaks, the right to breaks. And we're also pushing, of course, regulations federally and statewide. We have to fight on all fronts, understanding that in some of the fronts we're gonna lose, but we have to fight in all fronts.
Thanks, Leticia. And Alisha, can you tell us what your union's doing? You talked a lot about what the workers have gone through, losing their housing, and it's very interesting to me how, again, this idea of company housing and being so tied to your employers going on both in Canada and the U.S. in places we wouldn't see. So, Alisha, can you tell us what your union is doing to fight back against the things your members are dealing with climate?
Yeah, so I just, hearing what's going on and seeing the parallels, what I see is a return to a sort of indentured servitude that, it was always sort of in the fringe, but now we're seeing it more widespread happening again. And I feel like it's a fight that the labor movement has been taking on for a couple of generations at this point. I think that at the end of the day, we're trying to put better protections, obviously, in the collective agreement around the housing and what the employer can do, specifically when there's a dispute between the member, who's a unionized member, and the employer, and there may be a grievance process going on. The other thing is that we're pushing for legislation where they're required to release, because what's happening now is that they've done air testing, and I don't know if you can see the picture behind me, but the string across the actual fencing says that to be cautious because there is asbestos on the actual ground. And you can imagine that if the asbestos was wet, we wouldn't need to worry about it, or if it was covered, we wouldn't need to worry about it. But asbestos, as soon as you break the actual shell it is in, it is an airborne particular that can be moved around by dust. And so we're really trying to get at because obviously you have a town that's destroyed, you have historic buildings in it which did not follow current building standards and have things like you would see vermiculite, asbestos. And so we're really trying to ensure that in our legislation, and so this is more of a lobbying side of it, that in the legislation it says that the government is required to make those public. But what we have done is access to information and privacy request so that we can actually be the whistleblower on behalf of the membership about what is going on with the air quality. Because we're not just talking about the workers, right? I think sometimes when we talk about a worker being bound to a workplace, we're forgetting that often comes with their family. And what I heard today from Leticia is that she was a 13-year-old child that was in a workplace that was quite dangerous. And many of our members have their spouses and their small children in these scenarios where they're being subjected to things as if the employer had the reach to their families. And so we're working at putting protections in our collective agreements where we're actually protecting as far beyond as the member and looking at how can we protect their families as well in these scenarios. And interesting to hear the conversation on the heat side. And I think, Leticia, you and I can connect because we have fought for legislation on this in Canada. So at 45 degrees, there is a complete stop work in Canada, and that's through the actual labor code in Canada. So I would love to connect after this because this is a fight that we've undertaken because we had people pass away due to heat symptoms, and we have a formula on how many time on and how much time off depending on the temperature in the heat. And you can imagine that Canada, you can't think of Canada ever being 45 degrees. I mean, we're the home of the snow and the great wide north. But in our southern areas, we've had a lot of issues with temperatures, record-breaking temperatures every year for the last 7 years. And so when we go over 45 degrees, work stoppage has to happen. But it is a long process to get legislation changed and put cases before the Canadian Labor Board to get laws in place. So we are working to do that, but it is definitely an uphill battle, pushing a rock up a hill.
Thanks. A question for both of you. I've been thinking, when we talk about environment, so much of our rhetoric around saving the environment is about the future. And say, if we don't act now, we won't have an earth here for our children and our grandchildren. And so much of that mainstream frame, which exists in usually upper class circles, is we have to act now to preserve this legacy for our children. But you're dealing with things in the here and now. And so I just would love to hear your opinions on how can we work to reframe that discussion, to bring this forth, to not be thinking so much, yes, obviously the future is important. But I mean, when we're talking about people dropping dead in fields, start getting emotional, but we need to reframe what we're working on here. You're literally dealing with people dying right now, and other people are out there saying, we have to think about 20 years in the future. So what are your thoughts on how labor and environment can collaborate to reframe that discussion and really start realizing that we have a crisis now, and really bringing people like, what was the name?
Jose Arturo.
Jose Arturo, again, we should say that name, Jose Arturo, again, how do we show people what's really going on in the here and now?
I think it's also an issue about race, right? Like even within the labor movement, like we farm workers continue to be the unspoken of, right? Like we are in rural communities where nobody looks for us. Like the consumerism attitude has distanced everybody from their food, and nobody knows where their food comes from. Nobody knows what kind of suffering happens when a sweet potato gets put on your table. Like how, and like the complete disconnect. Workers are getting paid 50 cents for a 35 bucket of sweet potato, and they have to pick like over 37 buckets an hour in order to not get fired and sent back to Mexico, right? And one sweet potato costs almost $2. But I think it's the complete disconnect and the fact that we're not also addressing race with the issue, right? We still, as farm workers, we're exempt from minimum wage laws. We're exempt from NLRB. We don't have the right to organize. In North Carolina, it's actually illegal to request in our collective bargaining agreement to deduct dues. So it's really, really sad. And then we have just this power dynamic. Going back to Barnes, where Jose Arturo passed away, the owner of this company is a state legislator. Like she makes decisions on this kind of stuff, and they do. When we go out to visit workers and we can't find them, and we ask like the local store owners, hey, do you know where we can find Barnes labor camp? And they'll say, oh, you're looking for Lisa's boys, right? We're considered property, not humans. So I think it comes back to addressing like an issue of power, not just within money, but also race.
And Alisha, your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is the great challenge that we're facing in the labor movement that, wealthy people have convinced, both, people who settled in the Americas that it's black and brown people that are their enemy, who make less money than them and have less power to do anything. And yet, in their very faces, those individuals are going to legislators to take their rights away from them, and yet we're still the enemy. And I think that, we don't talk about that our conditions are still worse. And the labor movement in and of itself also needs a revolution. And you and I, Matt, have talked about this, is that I think that we really need to get to the core in the discussions about what's really happening. Oftentimes people are okay if somebody's exploited as long as it's not them. And I think that is a problem. For me, it's a principled integrity and values, morality issue as a society, that we're okay with that exploitation can happen as long as it doesn't happen to us. And when it does happen to us, we think it's because, black and brown people are not doing what they're supposed to do, because then I wouldn't be living in these conditions. And we continue to have this classist issue within the labor movement. And I think that until we deconstruct that as a mindset within the labor movement, we're going to continue to struggle. And the other thing that I find really challenging, and you know a bit about my background, but my mom's from a European background, and my father's African American and Cherokee. And what I would say at the end of the day is that my aunt, my mom's sister, was convinced that climate change didn't work, and other people are not, or it's not really happening. And, until other countries actually do something, why should we do something? And it's like, so our moral compass becomes, well, if other people are doing bad, why can't I do bad? And until other people do good, I'm not going to do good. And is that really where we want to be as a society? And lastly, what I would say is that, I was sounding again the alarm because I come from the Park Service, that there were issues with my family with climate for a better part of 15 years. And it wasn't until the storms of a lifetime started happening in her neighborhood, and in an area for 30 years that she lived had never had tornadoes, started having multiple tornadoes over the summertime. And when she had to put an insurance claim in because her vehicle was impacted and her house was impacted, she's like, oh, there's climate change. And I'm like, yep. And so the difficulty is, how do we get people who are not living it to understand the impacts of it on the people that are living it, right? We're having floods that we've never seen, rainstorms, and the number of tornadoes and hurricanes have increased. And yet people, until it hits their doorstep, can willfully ignore it. And it is I think one of our greatest challenges to get people to realize that just because it isn't impacting you doesn't mean it's not happening, and that you're not bearing the cost. Because that's the other thing. When the government bails out a community because the whole community has been burnt down because of climate change, those are your tax dollars at work, right? And, could we allocate our taxes to better things if we stop the impact we're having on the environment? And I think the answer is yes.
Great. So I want to make sure we allow time for some questions from the audience. But before we do that, do you have any any thoughts about what can the environmental movement learn from the work you're doing? What can the labor movement learn? And what would you like people to take away from today?
I think that a lot of people have not realized the danger that we're in. Like, our food systems are truly at risk, and we have to think beyond the price of our food. We have to think about how it's produced. Like, during this administration, there is such a big threat to our food systems, right? The tariffs, like, during his first administration, we lost like 30 growers because of his tariff war with China, right? We have growers that don't know whether they're going to plant sweet potato and berries this year because of the tariff war. So the pickling cucumber industry gets 40% of their cucumbers for pickling from Mexico. Like, how are we going to survive? I think it's really, really important to understand that our survival depends on the conditions of our food system and the life that farm workers are receiving while they're harvesting the crops.
Thank you. Alisha, any final thoughts before we take questions? You suddenly became muted, Alisha. I don't know why.
Sorry. What I would say is that the future generations that people were talking about is actually us, right? The generations that we said, they're going to be astronomical impacts. And, I'm sure many of you have heard the rhetoric about, Canada and the U.S. that's going on right now. But I will tell you, as somebody who's been an environmentalist and a labor activist, I was concerned about this 10 to 15 years ago. And the reason why is that there were projections that much of the southern U.S. that produces, avocados and vegetables would become soil that could no longer, because of the climate increasing, able to produce the food needed. And so when that happens, you have to move further north. When something becomes desert or unable to produce its own food, it needs expansion. And you're seeing that across the world, right? You're seeing people from all countries trying to find where the food sources are and where they can actually live in a way that they can eat well and actually survive. And I think both of the movements have to realize that the future that we've been warning about is actually the today that we're living.
Thank you. So at this time, I'd like to open it up. Any questions from the audience? Anyone? Yeah, Michael.
Thank you very much. That's really impressive. Can we hear me? I guess the question I have is that I teach about labor here at the university, and I've profiled the story of the Coalition of Immokalee Workers as a success story around the issues that your workers face. And I'm just wondering if is there a sweet potato boycott on the horizon, and of that worker-led organizing model, is that something that you're implementing, and where's the state of your organizing against these issues at this point?
We do have we are organizing around like the food chain. We have been pressuring Big Tobacco to take responsibility for some of the conditions that go on in the fields in the tobacco industry. Like, tobacco is awful in so many ways, right? Like, there was a study that was done a while back that proved that a worker who harvests tobacco for an hour could consume up to 10 packs of cigarettes through his body and his pores while he's harvesting, right? Plus the pesticides, plus the heat. So we've been pressuring Big Tobacco and some of the code of ethics. Like, unfortunately, code of ethics do not function unless workers have a say, right? And unless they're the ones that are pushing the enforcement and there's an effective enforcement mechanism. So we're still having conversations. We're also investigating Gerber and their role in the sweet potato purchasing that they have in North Carolina. So we're still in the process, but we definitely believe in the accountability of big ag and production companies.
Good morning. I'm interested that you both are representing labor, and we're here at a Climber Labor Conference. Are any climate organizations working with you and standing with you?
Yes, for sure. We do not function without our allies, right? We have a network of 500 drivers that we depend on during the harvest to have people drive workers to our meetings and to our trainings and to our different actions and things like that. We do work very closely with the North Carolina Environmental Justice Network, and we have a North Carolina Heat coalition, and we work very closely with health agencies and things like that.
And how about you, Alisha? Do you work with any environmental organizations in Canada?
At this point, we're not, and part of the issue, I think, between why labor has kind of not really been as active in the environmental side. You know, being somebody who worked in the park system, of course, I was always an environmentalist, but I think in Canada, the impacts have come much later. And I think that we had a government that started deregulating many things. Only in the last probably decade have the impacts become what they are. And so I think that we're kind of a little bit behind on the 8-ball on that one. And so it is definitely something that I'm approaching. But further to that, what I would say is that what I'm really trying to do is get the First Nations involved, because many of the places that we're talking about that are impacted are lands that, used to be First Nations lands and are now owned by the Crown. And in the way that they managed the lands before we came in, we're now seeing things like hyperabundant species in places because we've eliminated the human factor in the environment. And but it's definitely something that I've been pursuing over the last few months, is to really speak to the environmental groups about what is happening. Oftentimes, because we have to follow legislation, environmental groups are not as happy with workers that work for the government because we must loyally implement the elected government of the day's, rhetoric or, decisions. And so that puts our members in quite a difficult position, which is why I, at the national level, have been trying to cultivate those relationships. Great question.
And I want to thank both of you for sharing your information. My name is Christopher Sims, and I'll be presenting here too, but I'm thinking about, and I've done a lot of solidarity work, especially with Indigenous people and the Latinx community. Where might you be seeing or experiencing the solidarity work in, Alisha, with you in Canada between the Indigenous community and Black folk? And where might you see it here in this country where you're doing your work? Thanks.
You want to go first?
I can go first if you want. So it is definitely, I think, and I think it is definitely something that is developing. The relationships with groups like Black Lives Matter, First Nations, and the councils of First Nations are definitely places that we're really trying to bring into the fold. But for a long time in Canada, we had the perception of a public service worker that was neutral on the issues of the day. And it wasn't until a case was won at the Supreme Court of Canada that that window was thrown out. And we are now doing the work to actually get the relationships that we need. And for a long time, we could not speak out about public issues to the members of the public. And, and I don't know if this is true in the U.S. as it is true here, but there's a lot of resentment towards people who are federal workers because of the fact that they have to loyally implement the government that the people elected. I remember I was doing an interview maybe about 11 years ago, and this is when we had one of those less environmentally friendly governments of the day. And a reporter tried to catch me on, speaking out on it, and we didn't actually have a protection under the law for people speaking out. And I said, I can only implement what the government that the people have elected have given me as instructions. And in that way, what I really wanted people to understand is that, when you elect somebody, you have to understand that their platform is what the public service has to implement. And I think that some people think that may not be the case. And so I think there's an education part with some of these groups in terms of them understanding the conflict. And, I'm all about taking risks. I tell people all the time, I would love for them to fire me because I'd be on every news station. But I've also had activists who've said to me, well, that doesn't pay the bills. And I said, well, I don't know which one of my rights I'm willing to give up anymore because it seems like all of them are being taken away. So,
yeah. We, in agriculture, there's this thing like you fight to get out of it, right? And so like what that has created is that the same conditions have existed for decades for farm workers. The difference is the community that's there, right? So first Black workers and Filipino workers, Mexicans right now. And unless we come together as Black and brown and understand like the history and the connection we have, like we're doing a lot to educate our members to not be racist. Like honestly, we have to recognize that we ourselves are also racist amongst ourselves and with other communities that should be allies. And we have, I was lucky enough to learn that there's a need for Black and brown when I was young, and we had a meeting and the police came out to try to intimidate us, and a group of public workers came out, Black public workers came out and confronted the police and made them leave before our people could leave, right? Because they were gonna do some driver's license checkpoints. But we're always in need of unity, right? We have to unite amongst between races, between borders. We have to unite within industries, and we just have to continue fighting back because it's going to get worse.
I would just like to share that from 1975 to 1979, I was on staff with United Farm Workers Union in Coachella, California, started by Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta. And the farm workers were so smart. They taught us so much. And I hope all of you, if you have an opportunity, if you're ever out where there are farm workers working, we must have respect for the hard work they do. They are working very hard, and people buy fruits and vegetables and things in the store, and they never stop to think about who does all this work. And so I just encourage you to open your hearts and open your minds. Farm workers are amazing.
All right. Any other questions from the audience? I think in order to close then, for both Alisha and Leticia, so you both gave us just, I don't even have words for what you just gave us here, but very powerful, and thank you so much. But it's easy to get upset at the things you've told us, especially at an academic institution where we're sitting. It's easy to sit around and talk about things and get upset and then feel good about ourselves because we're upset about it. But if we don't walk out of here with action steps, we really haven't done our work. So for both of you, can you offer us any action steps that our assembly here can take as we walk out of here to help either of your organizations?
We have a table outside where you can join our listserv so you can be up to date on some of the things that are going on. You can definitely donate. We're always in need of volunteers and staff. If you want to donate your summer or your spring break to the movement and help us in our organizing efforts, please come. We just got a little piece of property that was donated, and we're hoping to build a housing unit for workers in emergency situations and for volunteers. So please sign up and get our updates.
Okay, and you'll have your table out in the lobby all day today and part of tomorrow, correct?
Yes.
Okay, great. And how about you, Alisha? What can we do?
Well, and I think you know this about me, Matt, but what I would say is that, we really need to amplify the message. And I think that sometimes we're in spaces where we're not actually talking about the issue that, these workers are actually facing on a daily basis. And we go back to our lives and we go to the grocery store and we have fresh strawberries in December, and we don't think about why is that possible in our climate when we don't have the ability to grow fresh strawberries, at least in Canada during the month of December. And so I think that we really have to be intentional about the decisions that we make, and we have to live our values. And I think, and we've talked about this through our program, Matt, is that, we gain so much institutional power. We're afraid that if we get militant about the things that we're passionate about, that we could lose the institutional power. But the institution has no value to the members or to the people if we are not willing to risk the institution for the individual. And if somebody's going to tell me that the institution has more value than one human life, I'm going to take great exception to that, because that person has a family, they're a child, they're a brother or a sister. We've heard today that people have died to try to save other people or to feed us, and we continue to go on with our lives. And I think the amplification of these issues, I get hearts and prayers all the time, and I'm like, I need you to move on the giving me your condolences and the prayers. I need your boots on the ground when our members are protesting what's happening to them. I need you showing up and reposting and talking to your networks and talking to your family. I mean, like I said, I was having a 20-year conversation with my aunt, and that conversation, we constantly were revisiting the conversation, and it wasn't until it impacted her. But trust me, I've lost friends because I thought, from my perspective, you're not really my friend if you don't understand where the issue is for workers today. And so I think that sometimes we have to take great risks to get new outcomes. And I've always believed that doing the same thing over and over again is the definition of insanity. And we need to do something different. We need to go back to some of our grassroots.
Thank you. Let's give a hand to Leticia and Alisha. So thank you both. Thank you, Alisha. Sad you couldn't be here in person, but so glad you're still able to join us through the miracles of technology. And just look forward to seeing you again. Thank you so much, both of you. And Cynthia and Rick, I think we're ready for you.